A forgotten mansion, 7 ancient keys, and a murder buried beneath layers of vengeance, not justice. Every door held a secret. Every secret led to a corpse. But the darkest secret of all. The killer wore a name that was never his, and claimed a legacy written in blood. Tonight you'll hear a story where the loyal butler becomes the executioner, where obsession with inheritance turns into a centuries-old curse, and where justice wears the twisted mask of revenge. This isn't just a tale of murder, it's a descent into the darkest corners of the human heart where truth and lies are separated by only one key. The only question is, will you stay long enough to see which key unlocks the final truth? It was on a cold, colorless October morning in the year 1932 that fate knocked quite literally upon our door, heralding the beginning of what would become one of the most cryptic and nerve-prickling investigations of my long and sometimes unsettling companionship with Monsieur Alaric Leclerc, the brilliant but elusive private investigator known in hushed circles as the Watcher of Shadows. I had just returned from a rather dull breakfast excursion, attempting to stir his interest with a convoluted tale of a jewel theft in Chelsea when there came a sharp, deliberate knock, 3 raps evenly spaced like the ticking of an ominous clock. Standing at the threshold was Miss Eliza Hartwell, our landlady's distant niece, a girl too quiet for her age and too pale for the season, clutching a yellowed telegram between trembling gloved fingers. "For Mr. Leclerc," she said, barely a whisper, as if the envelope carried a curse. Without a word, Leclerc took the telegram and slit it open with his ivory-handled knife, a practiced flick of the wrist, and his sharp green eyes, so unnervingly alive, scanned the message in a way that seemed to drink in its meaning beyond the ink. Then he handed it to me. The wording was stark yet strange: "Request your presence immediately. Stop unexpected death at Château Noirecour. Stop circumstances beyond ordinary comprehension. Stop your insight critical. Stop." Signed Commissaire Delroque, Sûreté Nationale. I looked up, but Leclerc was already on his feet, his gaze fixed on some invisible thread. "Not murder," he murmured, almost to himself. "Not a natural death either. No, this speaks of something forgotten." By mid-afternoon, we were aboard the Dover-Calais ferry beneath a sky swollen with leaden clouds, and by nightfall we were bouncing through the drenched and twisted lanes of the Breton countryside in a carriage that creaked like it too feared the destination. The air grew colder, heavier, and soon the mist swallowed the road, until at last, looming like some ancient sentinel, the Château Noirecour emerged from the fog, a black silhouette of Gothic towers, shuttered windows and centuries-old secrets. Perched atop jagged cliffs that dropped sheer into the churning Atlantic, the chateau exuded a sinister majesty, as if daring us to uncover what it had buried. Awaiting us in the courtyard was Commissaire Delroque, a man in his late 50s with worry etched deep into his features, whose clenched jaw and bloodshot eyes told us he had seen more than he could understand. "Gentlemen," he said in a voice that trembled beneath its formality, "I pray you were not too late." We were led into the chateau's cavernous halls, where the walls seemed to lean in, tapestries sagged under unseen weight, and the air itself felt laced with whispers. In the Baron's private study, an ancient room sealed by thick oak and silence, sat the body of Etienne d'Aubigny, the last scion of the Noirecour bloodline, slumped over his desk in death, his lifeless hand clutching half of an ornate brass key, whose jagged edge gleamed with cruel precision. The room bore no signs of struggle, no forced entry, no broken locks, only that strange envelope beside the body, black as morning silk, containing 6 other keys, identical in design yet unbroken, each one tagged with a name in ink that shimmered faintly, as though resisting time itself. 7 keys, Leclerc murmured, his eyes locked on the broken one. "But only 6 here," Delroque nodded solemnly. "And we do not know what they open, nor what the missing one conceals." Then in a voice barely audible, "The North Tower, some say it was seen alight last night, but that wing has been sealed since the fire of 1894. No one has stepped inside since, no one alive, at least." The silence that followed was thick and electric. Leclerc stepped back, his voice cold and certain. "Then, monsieur, I fear this is no ordinary death. This chateau holds more than secrets. It holds intentions, and they are not yet finished with us." The storm had not yet broken, but the air inside Château Noirecour felt charged, as though every breath carried the weight of an unsaid truth. It was just after dusk when we arrived, myself alongside the ever-enigmatic Monsieur Théo Duval, a man whose sharp intellect often concealed far older instincts. We were summoned in haste by a telegram wrapped in secrecy, and signed only with a crimson seal bearing the crest of the long-forgotten house Marceau. No one had lived in the chateau for over a decade, and yet tonight, its halls were alive with footsteps, hushed conversations, and the slow unraveling of something ancient. The gathering, we learned, had been arranged by the elusive Armand Marceau, the reclusive heir, whose name had not surfaced in Parisian society since the great trial of 1919. His invitation, sent just 10 days prior, summoned a curious list of individuals. Madame Isolde Verrier, a renowned opera singer, with a ruined voice and a vanished husband. Dr. Felix Nor, once a surgeon of great promise before his disgrace at Saint-Pierre Hospital. Mademoiselle Céline Rousseau, a young archivist, whose lineage was said to trace back to Marceau himself. Professor Albin Greymore, an English scholar of ancient codes and forbidden texts. Monsieur Lucien Moreau, a financier, whose empire crumbled under rumors of betrayal. And finally, Victoire Desjardins, an author of esoteric tales, whose last novel was mysteriously pulled from shelves. All had arrived by separate carriages the night before, and all, we were told, were unaware of one another's presence until the host revealed it at dinner. According to the valet, Armand rose at the head of the table, and declared that he would unveil a truth long buried, something that tied them all together, something that demanded reckoning. But before such a revelation could be uttered, the lights flickered, the great clock struck midnight, and Armand was found dead in his private study, his hand clutching a rusted iron medallion that bore a sigil unknown even to the most learned among us. On the desk beside him were 7 identical boxes, 6 intact, 1 smashed, as though someone had taken its contents and fled. Inside the remaining boxes lay antique keys, each etched with a name matching those of the assembled guests. A message, Théo murmured, his fingers brushing the edge of one with the name Verrier carved in careful script. Or perhaps a sentence. The butler, a gaunt man with haunted eyes, informed us that the guests had gathered in the Crimson Hall, and were demanding answers, some desperate to leave, others too stunned to speak. But none would be permitted to depart, not yet, for this was now a sealed house, one in which every occupant was both witness and suspect. As we moved through the winding corridors of Bellargent, the old stones seemed to whisper of memories never laid to rest. "What do you make of it?" I asked Théo as the doors of the Crimson Hall loomed ahead. He paused, listening not to sound but to silence. "This," he said, "is not a murder born of passion or impulse. This is a reckoning decades in the making. Each key is a link, each guest a chapter, and the truth, that waits behind the final lock." As the heavy doors creaked open and all eyes turned to us, I knew we were stepping not into a room, but into a puzzle wrapped in shadows, one where the past bled into the present, and the dead whispered truths only the guilty could hear. The moment we crossed the threshold into the dimly lit drawing-room of Raventon Hall, an uneasy silence enveloped the assembled guests like a shroud, 7 figures standing rigidly in the flickering glow of antique wall sconces, their faces painted with that peculiar blend of grief, apprehension, and concealed alarm that often follows an unnatural death. Though they rose with the formality expected in such moments, their eyes betrayed a simmering tension, as if each were measuring the others with quiet suspicion. Inspector Darnell, his tone clipped and rehearsed, began the introductions, but it was clear this gathering was anything but routine. First to step forward was Madame Celeste Renaud, a woman in her late 50s with a statuesque frame and an air of aristocratic sorrow that clung to her like perfume. Her gloved hands quivered ever so slightly as she spoke, her voice wrapped in cultivated poise. "Monsieur Leclerc, this is devastating." Julien was troubled. Yes, but surely no one could wish him harm. Her eyes lingered a second too long on the inspector's badge, betraying something unspoken. When asked about her relationship with the deceased, her composed facade cracked for a breath. "Once long ago, we were more than friends." Those days passed, but we had unfinished business. He summoned me here with urgency. Before I could press further, Dr. Emil Corvin, the family's long-serving physician, stepped into the light. His silver hair and wire-rimmed spectacles lent him a scholarly air, but there was something brittle in the way his fingers gripped each other behind his back. I tended to Julian for over a decade, he said, voice steady, but in recent years, he became consumed with family ghosts. He began seeing hidden messages in old records, pursued second opinions on ailments that did not exist. It became obsession. His eyes, dulled by too many secrets, briefly met mine. I feared he might do harm, to himself or others. Then came Vincent Mercer, tall and broad-shouldered, his gait stiff with a soldier's discipline, and his voice roughened by command. We were comrades in uniform, and friends before that. But he changed. He accused our fathers of crimes, claimed bloodlines were tainted and needed atonement. I warned him, some truths do not deserve to be unearthed. He looked toward the others, his expression darkening. He wouldn't stop digging. The next to speak was Eleanor Price, a young English woman with calm hazel eyes, and the quiet presence of someone used to watching from the edges. I was hired to catalogue the Raventon estate archives, she explained, her voice almost a whisper, but his true goal was always to find something hidden. Letters, ledgers, names struck from family trees. She hesitated, and he found something that terrified him. A soft cough drew our attention to a man reclining against the paneling, half-shadowed and entirely unreadable. Lucien Marchand, his legal counsel, he said flatly. I cleaned his past more than I advised him. He was desperate to erase connections, suppress events, some so old they predated him. Whatever he discovered, it made him reckless. Then, stepping forward with silent grace, came Delphine Raventon, Julian's estranged niece, her skin porcelain pale, and her voice frosted with resentment. He lured me here with promises, inheritance, reconciliation. I knew better. He dealt in manipulations, but this time, he said there were sins in the Raventon name that demanded reckoning. Her voice broke, just slightly, before she regained herself. I didn't come for answers. I came to see if he meant what he said. As each voice added to the intricate web of secrets, betrayals and fractured pasts, a cold certainty settled in my mind. Julian Raventon had uncovered something poisonous in the foundation of his bloodline, something so damning that it had cast long shadows across everyone gathered in that room. The air grew denser with each word, each guarded glance, each half-truth veiled in civility. Inspector Darnell, sensing the same undercurrent, cleared his throat, and addressed them all with quiet authority. No one leaves until we understand what Julian found, and who wanted it buried with him. And in that instant, I knew somewhere within this elegant hall of heritage and hypocrisy stood the architect of a carefully calculated murder, and they were watching us just as intently as we watched them. He had summoned them all under the pretense of a historical symposium, 7 carefully selected individuals from disparate corners of Europe, each with a specific expertise, each unknowingly tied to a legacy cloaked in dust and darkness. The invitation had spoken of quiet research at Valmont Hollow, a secluded manor nestled deep within the mist-shrouded woods of northern Brittany, where time itself seemed to stall beneath sagging chimneys and ivy-strangled stone. A governess had been requested at first, though it was quickly revealed there were no children in the manor, only secrets. The real purpose, Elric Valmont confessed upon their arrival, was far more sinister: assistance in deciphering ancient manuscripts, untranslated legal archives, and forgotten genealogies tied to his noble bloodline. His ancestors, he claimed in a voice trembling with both awe and dread, had been victims of monstrous betrayal, falsely accused of heresy, witchcraft and treason during the 17th and 18th centuries. At the sprawling dinner table, where candlelight flickered against oil-dark portraits, the guests introduced themselves, each eyeing the others with quiet unease. Professor Adrian Marlowe, a sallow-skinned academic known for his unorthodox views on dynastic corruption, admitted he'd worked with Valmont briefly, until a dispute erupted. He was no longer searching for facts, the professor said, his voice thin and brittle, but for vindication, for blood-stained justice. When I refused to bend history to his will, he accused me of cowardice, of betrayal. Across the table, Leora Deneuve, a curator of medieval art, detailed how she had examined a collection of obscure paintings Valmont had acquired, macabre family portraits with unsettling eyes and ghostly brushwork. He was convinced they contained secret confessions, she whispered, hidden symbols, warnings even. He believed the painter knew the truth. Next was Sebastian Durell, a soft-spoken art restorer who had handled the same works. They were authentic, yes, he confirmed. But he didn't care about value. He said the canvas whispered, accused, that crimes had been immortalized in pigment, waiting centuries to be seen. Then came Camille Roux, a stern folklorist, whose studies of local legends had unearthed tales of a noble house that made a blood oath to a forgotten deity, only to be cursed into obscurity. He begged me to confirm that his family was the victim, not the perpetrator, she said. But myths don't work like that. They're mirrors, not maps. Etienne Laval, a private antiquarian with a hunted look in his eyes, finally spoke. Valmont found something, a reliquary sealed since the Revolution. 6 keys were made for it, each bearing a name. Ours. He claimed the box contained irrefutable evidence that one of us was descended from the traitor who damned his line. Silence fell like a shroud. Before anyone could respond, the ancient butler appeared at the doorway, face ashen. In one trembling hand he held a small black box, in the other, a telegram. "Forgive me," he said, voice heavy with dread. "But Master Valmont was discovered this morning. The West Tower was locked from within. There was no sign of forced entry." Inspector Alaric Virel stepped forward, eyes narrowing, every syllable sharp as steel. 6 keys, 6 guests. The box remains unopened, but its secret was known to someone. One among you used their key. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle like a blade across their throats. The question is not only why, but how long they've known. The storm had evolved from a mere atmospheric disturbance into something far more sinister, a trap, deliberate and suffocating. As though nature itself had conspired with the unseen menace among us. When Colonel Destrieux received word that not only had the bridge collapsed but that the landslide had severed the only remaining access route to the mainland, a dreadful hush fell over the room, the kind that stretches taut with unspoken fear. "You mean we're stranded here?" he asked, his voice low, but laden with the dread everyone else was too afraid to voice. Inspector Renaud's grave nod was answer enough. 3 days at the very least, if the weather holds. I noticed then a peculiar flicker cross the face of Dr. Lucien Carreau, a man never known to conceal his thoughts, suddenly cloaked in something furtive and unreadable. Outside, the storm battered the old manor with primal fury, but within those ancient walls, something colder, more calculated, had begun to take shape. At just past 7, a pounding knock shattered my fragile sleep. I swung open the door to find Camille, the chateau's aging librarian, standing breathless and wild-eyed. "It's Dr. Vallin. He's dead. In the library. You must come now." Moments later, we descended the twisting corridors to the once regale library, now a shrine to silent horror. Dr. Vallin's lifeless body lay collapsed beside the reading desk, eyes frozen wide open, mouth slightly agape, as though the last thing he saw had burned through his soul. One arm was draped across an old leather-bound journal, fingers curled tightly as though clinging to something unspeakable. Inspector Renaud knelt, carefully prying the journal loose, but the pages offered only fragmented phrases, their meaning distorted by panic. That night, when he came. I know now, and he does too. Beyond that, nothing. The rest had been torn out, recently, and with deliberate precision. The room itself bore no signs of a struggle, no overturned chairs, no shattered glass, only a single object out of place, a small bronze key lying beside Vallin's feet. It was unmistakably one of the 6 ancient keys mentioned during last night's fireside conversation, each one said to belong to a different bloodline tied to a centuries-old betrayal. But now, one key was missing, and the person who held it was either marked for death, or had already chosen their side in this unfolding game. Renaud turned to us, eyes grim. "We're not just trapped. We've been selected, each of us summoned here for a reason. And whoever started this game." He let the sentence trail off, but we could all feel it, a presence lurking just out of sight, calculating its next move. The first piece had been removed from the board, but the game had only just begun. The rain tapped softly at the stained glass dome of the solarium, a fragile rhythm that barely concealed the growing tension within. Inspector Holcroft narrowed his eyes, the flicker of doubt tightening his features as he gazed at the lifeless figure sprawled near the marble fountain. "You suspect an accident?" he asked coldly. "No," replied Cassian Miles, the antiquities historian summoned under strange circumstances. "I suspect something older, something unresolved." His voice was laced with dread. Just then, all eyes turned to the door of the solarium, where a single sheet of parchment fluttered under a rusted nail, its ink faded but deliberate, the handwriting elegant yet venomous. "Judgment shall revisit the bloodline. Selcourt, 1724. Gasps echoed, and Lady Morel clutched her pearls, paling instantly. "Selcourt," she whispered, eyes wide. That name was buried. Cassian's brow darkened. Not buried, forgotten, and now awakened. Holcroft, now visibly unsettled, ordered a search of the evidence room, only to return moments later, pale and shaken. "The seal key," he muttered. "From Lord Astley's estate collection, it's gone." Dr. Elric Folden arrived shortly after, his medical bag clutched tightly, though his hand trembled as he examined the body. A woman of noble descent, now twisted unnaturally, neck broken clean, her gaze frozen in silent terror. "Immediate death," he confirmed, then added with unease. "But see this, bruising around her shoulders, as if someone held her down before the fall." Meanwhile, Cassian had begun a meticulous search of the solarium, his eyes landing on a faint fogged outline on the window overlooking the estate's ancestral hall. "Here," he beckoned. "There's a smear, and beneath it, look." A fine hairline crack spidered through the glass, the precise height where a figure might have been pressed, observing unseen. "Someone was watching," he murmured. "But whom?" Their inquiry was cut short by the arrival of the other guests, each reacting in their own telling way. Lord Whitmore thundered with indignation, Lady Thorne maintained an unnaturally calm poise, while Elias Crane, the youngest heir, looked positively sick, sweat clinging to his collar despite the chill. "This is no coincidence," Holcroft muttered. "First Julian, now Althea, both connected by blood, and by guilt." Cassian turned to him, eyes narrowing. "And bound by history," he added grimly. "Selcourt, 1724. That year marked the hanging of Esmeline de Voir, wrongly accused, brutally silenced. And this," he gestured toward the parchment, "this is no warning, it's a reckoning." Without waiting, he stepped through the east corridor toward the estate's gallery, where centuries of ancestors stared down from oil and canvas. The room whispered with memory, and as he paused before a portrait of a raven-haired woman cloaked in midnight blue, her eyes seemed to burn through the varnish. The plaque beneath read simply, "Edie, 1724. And for the first time, Cassian felt it, the air shift, the temperature drop, as if the gallery itself was listening, or remembering. As thunder cracked, like the wrath of ancient gods over the brooding sprawl of Ravencourt Manor, a hush fell upon the grand hall as Inspector Valmont's eyes locked onto a neglected corner where a heavy velvet drape had fallen, revealing a forgotten oil portrait, cloaked in dust and sorrow. The young woman depicted stared out with an unsettling blend of grace and doom, her Renaissance-style gown opulent, hinting at wealth and nobility, but it was her eyes that gripped the soul, wide, haunted, almost pleading, as if she were trapped mid-confession. The tarnished plaque beneath bore only a name and two chilling dates, Eleanor Ravel, 1713 to 1730. 17. Valmont murmured more to himself than to us, and the year of the Ravencourt reckoning. Tension rippled through the gathered guests, now whispering among themselves like leaves stirred by a cursed wind. I stepped closer, unable to look away. There was a sadness carved into the strokes of the painter's brush, but also a quiet defiance, as though Eleanor had known her fate long before it arrived. "This was no ordinary death," Valmont continued, turning to Dr. Alaric Fenn, whose scholarly poise had crumbled into visible distress. "Tell us, doctor, what really happened to her?" Fen hesitated, glancing toward the others before speaking in a voice hushed with guilt. The official record claims she died in the West Wing fire, but journals from that period, long hidden, speak of secret rites, forbidden knowledge, and a betrayal orchestrated by those closest to her. Families still bearing influence today. And they profited from her fall. Valmont pressed, his tone ice-sharp. Some did, Fen admitted. There were land disputes, inheritance claims, and a rejected magistrate whose name was redacted from all but one document. Before another word could be uttered, a sudden thunderous crash echoed from deep within the manor's bowels, a metallic shattering boom that silenced every breath. We raced toward the source, hearts hammering, only to find the ancient wine cellar door hanging ajar, its hinges groaning like a dying voice. Behind it, a hidden passage had been revealed, narrow, cold and suffocating, carved into the very foundation of the estate. As our lanterns flickered against the damp stone walls, strange sigils emerged, etched with obsessive precision, some half erased, others weeping fresh moisture that glistened like blood. "These symbols are corrupted," Miss Corwin whispered, her voice quivering with recognition. Originally protective, now twisted into something sinister. Deeper in the passage, beneath a mound of crumbling stone, lay a rusted hook, recently disturbed and smeared with something dark and wet. "This is no longer a case of murder," Valmont said grimly. "This is a summoning." Back in the main hall, the air had thickened with fear. The storm outside clawed at the windows as if trying to get in, or let something out, and the guests had clustered into uneasy groups, suspicion and dread painting their faces pale. The phone lines were still dead, the bridge still collapsed, and with every tick of the grandfather clock, the walls of Ravencourt seemed to press in tighter. And amidst it all, Eleanor Ravel's painted eyes continued to stare through the gloom, knowing, grieving, waiting, as if the truth she had died with refused to remain buried any longer, clawing its way through centuries of silence to demand retribution from those still breathing. In the dim flickering light of the oil lamp, Professor Aldrich Renwin adjusted his trembling spectacles, the reflection of fire dancing in his eyes, though the chill in his voice betrayed a different kind of fire, one born of dread. Behind him, the old portrait of Isadora Vane loomed large on the cracked wall, her painted expression, haunted, defiant, and unnervingly lifelike, seemed to watch them all, not with paint but with presence. "I'm convinced," the professor began, his voice low and brittle, "that the old accusations weren't mere stories. They are the root of what's happening to us now." A heavy silence gripped the room. "They said Isadora consorted with shadows," he continued. "That she cursed the village harvests, brought illness to households, caused misfortune wherever she walked. It all sounds like superstition now, but in 1741, superstition was all it took to justify a death sentence." Colonel Vane leaned forward, eyes narrowed. "Who led the trial against her?" The professor hesitated, then his voice dropped further, almost a whisper. "Gerard Vane, my ancestor." Inspector Thorough sat up straight, his tone sharp. "You're telling us, you descend from the magistrate who condemned her?" Renwin nodded slowly, shame weighing down every word. "He was paid. Witnesses were bought, evidence fabricated. The trial was a performance. Isadora was sentenced for crimes she never committed. And then," Lady Merrow asked, barely breathing, "she was imprisoned. But she never made it to the gallows. 4 days in custody, and she died. Cause of death officially listed as fever, but 2 prisoners later claimed she was poisoned." All eyes turned to Dr. Silas Marlowe, who had been silent until now, his hands trembling in his lap. "That was my ancestor. If what you're saying is true, he might have silenced her, to keep the truth buried forever," Thorough murmured. "And now, someone who has uncovered the truth, is delivering punishment not to the original culprit, but to their bloodline." Suddenly, Carlden Meyer, the art historian who had been quietly observing, broke in, voice sharp with disbelief. "You think we're being targeted for the sins of our ancestors, that we're all heirs to some cursed history?" The inspector's eyes narrowed. "You've studied this manor for years, the paintings, the hidden archives. Have you ever come across anything unusual, a journal, a relic?" Carlden hesitated. "There was one journal," It was encrypted. It mentioned a cursed knight, and a child. But I assumed it was fiction. Fiction. Pharaoh's voice was razor-thin now. If Isadora was imprisoned but died shortly after, and if she was pregnant, then her bloodline may not have ended. Silence fell again, heavier this time, as realization settled over the group like dust on a forgotten tomb. But she was never married, Dr. Marlowe whispered. She was in prison, and yet, Pharaoh said slowly, walking toward the painting, look here. This portrait was made in 1743, 2 years after her death. Posthumous. But look closely, near the bottom at her feet, that faint shadow, almost invisible. That's a child. Miss Soren, the archivist, quickly flipped through her notes. There's a convent record. An unnamed infant was taken in around that time. A nurse was suddenly dismissed, and disappeared from the registry. Just then, a draft swept through the chamber, and in the moonlight filtering through the high windows, the sound of a distant shivering cry echoed faintly, neither laughter, nor a scream, but something in between. The professor turned pale. There's someone in this house, Pharaoh said under his breath. Someone who carries the blood of Isadora Vane. Someone resurrecting justice from the grave. Faces turned to one another, suspicion blooming like rot behind their eyes. No one spoke, no one dared. Somewhere within the manor's hollow bones, another sound emerged, a rustling breath, inhuman and close, so very close. The silence in the chamber, shattered like brittle glass, as Inspector Alaric Trenholm stood frozen, the cracked parchment in his gloved hand confirming what they had long feared. The records surrounding Lady Isaline Varnell's downfall had not merely been misplaced, they had been deliberately erased, manipulated with surgical precision, to conceal the existence of an heir, one whose claim could unravel everything, and expose a conspiracy centuries in the making. It's no coincidence, Alaric murmured. An illegitimate child would have inherited not only her fortune, but the motive to unearth the truth. As if summoned by the weight of his words, the manor's butler, an aging man named Corwin, appeared breathlessly at the archway, his form trembling with urgency that did not suit his usual stoic grace. Forgive the intrusion, sir, he said gravely, but something has been discovered beneath the western wing, in the sanctum chambers. You may want to see it, now. The group exchanged wary glances before Alaric nodded, his voice hardening. Then lead the way, Mr. Corwin. It seems the house is not finished speaking. The descent through the hidden passage was oppressive, stone walls slick with age, the smell of damp earth and decaying secrets clinging to every breath, as their lanterns cast monstrous shadows that seemed to flinch at their presence. They emerged into a long-forgotten vault, older than any part of the estate above, its ceiling arched like a cathedral of silence. Along the far wall, sealed beneath thick cobwebs and time-blistered hinges, stood a row of ancestral chests untouched for generations. This chamber was uncovered only this morning, Corwin whispered. A portion of the foundation collapsed during the storm, revealing what had been hidden since the Black Year. Alaric approached the nearest chest, heart pounding, and slowly lifted the lid to reveal a collection of personal effects so intimate, so chillingly preserved, that time itself seemed to stagger. There lay Lady Isaline's mourning veil, her sapphire rosary, parchment-wrapped letters scrawled in ink as dark as dried blood, and most damning, a journal bound in crimson leather, its pages fragile yet alive with fury. She wrote this in her final days. Alaric whispered, flipping through trembling entries where Isaline named each conspirator, judges who were bribed, physicians who forged diagnoses, even her cousin's betrayal in exchange for the family estate. Listen, he said, his voice barely a whisper. They thought the gallows would silence me. But truth roots deep beneath stone and sin. Let those who wear my blood seek what was buried, and avenge what was stolen. A gasp broke the silence as another name appeared. Lord Everin Thornley, the inspector's own ancestor, implicated as the very man who fabricated the charges of witchcraft that led to Isaline's execution. Alaric staggered back, pale, breathless. That can't be, he muttered. My family served justice. But the journal told another story. A story of stolen lands, rewritten bloodlines, and an unborn child whisked away under night's cover. hidden not to protect, but to preserve vengeance. The air in the vault seemed to thicken, as if the chamber itself had been holding its breath for centuries, waiting for someone to read aloud the curse it had been built to contain. Above them, the manor creaked like a slumbering beast disturbed, and from somewhere deep within its bones, a soft cry rose, a sound too human to be the wind, yet too broken to be called a voice. They were not alone, and whoever had returned to claim Lady Isoline's justice had just begun their reckoning. The evening had settled into a dim haze, the clock chiming 4, yet an eerie stillness hung over Morven Manor, as if the mansion itself were clutching onto a secret too dark to whisper aloud. Inside the sprawling library, where the scent of old paper and the weight of ancient knowledge lingered like ghosts in the air, Detective Alaric Devane stood immersed in Professor Elric Danforth's labyrinth of historical research, every note, every brittle page a breadcrumb in some forgotten trail. Then the heavy wooden door creaked open, and Inspector Lawrence stepped in, his composed face hiding a flicker of unease. "Detective Devane," he said quietly, "Professor Danforth has disappeared. No one's seen him since lunch, and his room is completely empty." Devane didn't speak. He simply stood, the look in his eyes sharpening like a blade. "How long?" he asked. "Roughly 3 hours," Lauren replied. The maid assumed he was resting, but when she went to prepare his room for the evening, it was vacant. Without wasting a second, we swept into the shadowed halls of the manor, calling his name, our footsteps echoing through corridors that felt like they were listening in. Every door opened to silence, every corner held its breath. Then Lady Althea halted mid-step, a faint tremor in her voice. "He mentioned the Codex of Volanthus. Maybe he returned to the library." We rushed back, only to find him there, or what was left of him, slumped motionless over a reading desk bathed in the silver light of the window, his head resting on an ancient tome marked with strange dark stains. At first glance, they might have passed for spilled tea, but the broken fragments of his glasses and the dry lines around his mouth whispered a different story. "Stay back," Devane ordered as Dr. Verlan bent over the body. "He's been gone for a while, at least 2 hours," she confirmed. "The cause appears to be the same toxin as in the Fairley case. It didn't enter through the chest, it passed through the hands." Devane was already examining the book under a glass. He flipped a page, then paused. "This isn't tea. Hastings, look at this crystalline residue, faint metallic glint." The poison was on the pages themselves. My heart tightened, but how would someone know he'd touched this exact book? Before I could finish, Lady Althea picked up a folded note left on a nearby stand, familiar handwriting traced across it. "The one who sought truth now faces justice. For Marlowe, 1724. Devane checked the professor's coat. Another key was missing. "That's gone too," he muttered. But his gaze stayed locked on the cursed tome. It wasn't just an old document. It was a historical ledger, possibly a church record or trial account. But the real horror unfolded in the margins, where Danforth had written fresh notes in pencil. He had drawn connections between Latin names and modern bloodlines, mapping out a lineage that had remained buried for centuries. "This wasn't just research," Devane said grimly. "It was evidence, and he'd found the thread that ties Marlowe's killers to someone alive today." A strange shiver passed through the room, as though the walls themselves were mourning. Thunder cracked outside, and the manor's windows shuddered violently, while a single thought surged in my mind. This wasn't just a murder, it was a reckoning, the resurfacing of ancestral sins. And within this mansion, anyone could now be a suspect, because justice had returned wearing a mask of vengeance, and its hand could fall next upon any one of us. The storm outside Ravencourt Hall had risen to a furious crescendo, as if nature itself raged against the centuries of secrets buried beneath its ancient stones. And inside, the library was cloaked in an eerie, oppressive silence, broken only by the soft scratch of pen on paper, and the trembling breath of Miss C. As she leaned over Inspector Rourke's shoulder, her eyes scanning the yellowing notes left by the late Professor Whitcomb, notes that had grown increasingly erratic, as though the weight of his discovery had driven him to the edge of madness. "He didn't just confirm his family's part in the betrayal," she whispered, voice tight with unease. "He traced it further. There's mention of a veiled union, a clandestine child, a hidden heir, and for a heartbeat the room felt colder, as if the walls themselves inhaled sharply. Rourke turned to her, his eyes narrowing, as the realization clicked into place with terrifying clarity. If Lady Lysandra Norgrave had borne a child in secret before her execution, that child's bloodline would have survived, concealed in shadow for generations. And now, perhaps the final descendant had returned to right a wrong sealed by history. Before either of them could speak, the heavy library doors burst open, and Edwin Mallory staggered in, face pale, hair disheveled, a sheen of sweat on his brow as he gasped. The portrait in the East Gallery. It's been altered, not ruined but revealed. And we followed him through the candle-lit corridors, our footsteps echoing like ghostly warnings until we reached the long gallery, where the storm outside cast lightning into the room like strobes of truth. And there we saw it, the grand oil painting of Lady Lysandra, long believed to portray her in solitary defiance, now revealed through careful cleaning, and the removal of centuries of painted lies, showed her not alone, but cradling an infant to her chest, her expression no longer mournful, but fiercely protective, and it became horrifyingly clear that someone had buried this truth on purpose, painted over it to erase the child's existence from memory, from history, from vengeance. She wasn't childless, Miss Calder whispered, trembling. She left behind blood, and now that blood seeks justice. And just as that realization rooted itself in our minds, another absence was noticed.
Victor Lennox, the quiet antiquarian, the one who had always lingered near the records, who had always been nervous, withdrawn, now nowhere to be found. He'd last been seen descending toward the ancient wine cellars after dusk, and Rourke ordered a search at once, torches and lanterns in hand. We descended into the depths beneath the manor, into cellars hewn from bedrock where the air grew damper, thicker, and each breath carried the weight of mold, rot, and something else. The unmistakable copper tang of blood. The flickering light barely pierced the labyrinthine rows of decaying oak barrels. And then tucked behind a broken wine rack, we found him, Victor Lennox, sprawled across the stone floor, his eyes wide in death, his fingers still clutching a brittle scroll bearing Lady Lysandra's crest, and beside him, smeared in his own blood, a phrase scratched into the dirt with dying urgency. Sanguis vocet sanguinem. Blood calls to blood. The silence that followed was suffocating, as though the chateau itself mourned or bore witness, and I knew with sickening certainty that this was not random murder but a design, an execution carried out with ritualistic precision by someone who believed themselves to be the voice of buried bloodlines, the hand of intergenerational justice. 3 names of the original traitors had been struck, 3 corpses now lay cold, and of those who remained, Miss Calder, Colonel Branham, Dr. Selwyn, and Inspector Rourke, one would soon face the final reckoning, and somewhere among us, behind a mask of civility and sorrow, walked the last living descendant of Lady Lysandra Norgrave, a child of fire and vengeance whose justice had waited 300 years to be born in blood. Beneath the rotting beams of the chateau's forgotten cellar, hidden behind layers of stone and shadows untouched for centuries, we stumbled upon a scene so haunting, it felt as though time itself had frozen in horror. Lucien Delacroix, the reclusive and controversial art historian, lay sprawled across the cold stone floor in a grotesque arc, one lifeless hand clutching a torn fragment of a once priceless painting now shredded beyond recognition, the canvas slashed with such violent precision that each stroke seemed to scream in silent agony. It was no random act of destruction. No, this was the rage of someone desperate to erase more than just paint, someone terrified of what that artwork revealed, for even in its desecrated state, the remaining brushstrokes whispered of 18th-century French elegance, and yet deeper still, hinted at something far more damning, a clandestine gathering in a garden, shadowy figures encircling a single woman, their faces twisted in judgment, their intentions hidden behind powdered masks, as though the painting had captured a memory meant to be buried forever. Inspector Elric Marlowe approached with cold precision, his gloved fingers brushing delicately against a shard of gilded frame before signaling Dr. Saville, who examined the corpse with the solemn gravity of a man who had seen too much.
His breath caught slightly as he leaned in, whispering, curare, delivered not through ingestion, but skin likely hidden in the very fibers of the frame itself, a trap laid in silence. And then, just beneath a tattered corner of canvas, Miss Thorne gasped at the sight of a locket, forced open to reveal the miniature portrait of Marie Delphine, the long-condemned artist whose life had been stolen by a fabricated scandal, a woman whose work was said to have exposed the political betrayals of powerful men, painted into her landscapes like ghosts no one dared name. This wasn't murder, Marlowe murmured, eyes narrowing. This was execution. And before the weight of that truth could settle, a scrap of parchment fluttered from the rafters above, impaled by an iron spike. The ink faded but the message unmistakable. Blood remembers. The key is passed. Justice waits beneath the floorboards of liars. And just like that, the atmosphere shifted, as if the very stones of the chateau had exhaled centuries of secrets. But Marlowe's attention turned sharply to the wine rack behind Lucien's body. His eyes locked on a faint unnatural flicker between two dusty bottles. "Do you feel it?" he whispered. And I did. A subtle movement of air like breath escaping from a hidden mouth in the wall. He reached forward, pressed against a discolored stone, and with a soft grind of centuries-old hinges, the wall shifted, revealing a pitch-black tunnel that descended deeper than the foundations should have allowed. Our lanterns barely touched the darkness as we entered, each step echoing with a whisper that felt almost human, and the passageway twisted like a serpent through the veins of the chateau, revealing an entire secret network built during the reign of kings, a labyrinth used by someone who knew the layout, like muscle memory. Here we found remnants of the killer's mind, old letters, burned sketches, torn ledger pages, and among them, 3 names circled in blood-red ink, the surviving descendants of the nobles who once destroyed Delphine's name, and worse, her truth. These tunnels led not just to forgotten rooms, but to the very chambers where each of the previous victims had met their end. Madame Moreau in the conservatory, Professor Dufresne in the library, each death surgical, intimate, ritualistic, as though a debt was being collected from the bloodline, not just the person. "He's not hunting," Marlowe said with quiet fury. "He's fulfilling an oath." And as we emerged from the catacombs into the dim glow of the salon, we found the remaining guests seated like condemned souls, pale and breathless, clutching their wine glasses as though they could drown their fear in the silence. But no one spoke, not even Dr. Saville, whose medical bag now sat unopened beside his chair, because all of them had felt it too, that shift in the air, that sense that the past was no longer content to stay buried. And Marlowe turned to me slowly, his voice low and cold as stone. "We are no longer solving a murder, Hastings. We are unraveling a curse scribed in oil, sealed in blood, and signed with the name of a woman who died screaming beneath a gavel, held by the ancestors of those who sit upstairs, still breathing." Colonel Braithwaite moved with the sharp, deliberate grace of a man who had once led men into the jaws of death, and returned scarred but standing, his shoulders still squared with military resolve, the floorboards beneath him groaning in protest, beneath the weight of memories too heavy to shed. The leather-bound journal he clutched to his chest bore the scuffs and cracks of decades, its corners worn smooth by anxious fingers. This was no mere record. It was a vault of secrets, one he guarded as if the pages inside might bleed if opened. Miss Langford sat stiffly in the high-backed armchair by the hearth, her posture noble yet tense, her knuckles bone-white where they gripped the lace handkerchief in her lap. Though her face remained calm, a porcelain mask of control, her eyes shimmered with the weight of unspoken truths, and the way her breath hitched at the colonel's words betrayed the fear she so desperately sought to conceal. "4 have fallen," the colonel announced, his voice like stone dragged across marble, resonating through the drawing room like a funeral bell, tolling in the distance. Alaric Evangeline, the professor, and now Paul Lamont. The names fell one by one, each like a nail hammered into a coffin. The silence that followed was thick and suffocating, the only sound the low pop and hiss of the fire consuming the last of the dry logs. The velvet drapes hung like mourning veils, absorbing light, hope and breath itself. Miss Langford leaned forward, her voice low and tremulous but charged with urgency. Inspector, surely even you must see it now. These deaths, they're no coincidence. They're a pattern, a message. Inspector Halcroft's sharp eyes flicked toward her, then slowly swept the room like a hawk sizing up prey. No coincidence, he said, his voice clipped and cold as steel. This is not a series of accidents. It's an orchestration, each death executed with purpose. Chosen, calculated. Someone is eliminating us, one by one, with surgical precision. In the dim corner near the rain-smeared window, Dr. Verlaine sat slumped in a worn chair, his once confident hands now trembling, his face gaunt with sleeplessness and dread. "We're being hunted," he rasped, his voice like parchment tearing. "But not for what we are, for what we come from. This isn't about us, it's about the past." He looked up, hollow-eyed. "How can we be punished for ghosts we've never met?" Miss Langford stepped forward, a stack of yellowed documents pressed to her chest like a shield, the edges brittle with age. "Because someone believes blood carries sin," she whispered. Marie Charbonne did not just curse her executioners, she prophesied that justice, if not in her time, would arrive eventually. And if she had a child, her voice faltered, then steadied, then that child's blood lives on. Among us, watching, waiting, avenging. The firelight flared as if in response, casting wild shadows on the walls. A silence gripped us once more, deeper than before, as though the manor itself held its breath. Then Dr. Verlaine surged upright, knocking his chair askew, his voice edged with panic. "But who? Who among us carries that legacy, and how do we stop them before another life is taken?" All eyes turned toward the massive portrait that loomed on the far wall. Marie Charbonne, restored to chilling vibrancy, her features hauntingly beautiful, eyes dark and endless. Yet what chilled us most wasn't her stare, which seemed to pin each of us to the spot, but the small figure nestled in her painted arms, an infant once hidden by centuries of grime and lacquer, now exposed in perfect clarity. The child's expression was ambiguous, neither innocent nor accusing, but it radiated presence. It was not simply a detail, it was a statement. The truth, the killer's pride may have betrayed them, Inspector Halcroft said, stepping toward the portrait. Restoring this, it required skill, knowledge, access. Whoever did this revealed something they meant to use for fear, but in doing so, they've exposed themselves. Colonel Braithwaite narrowed his eyes. "So you're saying, what? That the killer is one of us?" Halcroft's voice was ice. "I'm saying the killer is closer than we feared. This wasn't restored by a stranger, it was revealed by someone inside these walls, someone who knew exactly what they were doing." And then, as if summoned by the revelation, the lamps above us gave a sudden sharp hiss, and died. Darkness rushed into the room like a wave crashing through shattered glass, and the flames in the hearth dimmed to sullen embers. For a moment, we were lost in total blackness, a blindness thick enough to taste. Then came the sound, the unmistakable rhythm of footsteps, calm, deliberate, and moving just above us in the upper corridor. Not running, not fleeing, hunting. My breath caught, the air grew colder, and somewhere beyond the suffocating dark, behind the velvet curtains of shadow and silence, Marie Charbonne's air moved unseen, no longer waiting, but preparing to strike again. The candlelight danced nervously against the tall dust-veiled windows of the Ashcroft estate, as the storm outside rattled the ancient glass panes, casting long crooked shadows across the floor, like grasping fingers from the past. Inspector Merrick stood motionless over the body of Dr. Elwood Greaves, whose pale frame rested on the edge of the four-poster bed, with arms unnaturally straight at his sides. The glinting poison vial nestled too perfectly in his open palm. His face, unsettlingly calm, bore no trace of the agony suffered by the previous victims, a stark contrast to the horrors they had unearthed thus far. A brittle piece of parchment lay on the nightstand, corners curled with damp and trembling ink, containing a written confession in Dr. Greaves' familiar hand. In it, He claimed to have uncovered a centuries-old family secret, a blood-stained legacy linked to the execution of Lydia Marrowstone, a woman unjustly hanged by his ancestors for witchcraft. Overwhelmed by shame and fearing the truth would soon emerge, he admitted to poisoning the other guests to protect his lineage's secret, ultimately succumbing to guilt and taking his own life. "How delightfully convenient," sneered Colonel Redgrave, pacing the room with his trademark rigid precision, the creak of his boots the only sound for several seconds. "The killer delivers us a confession, removes himself from the equation, and leaves the rest of us with a polished, bloodless conclusion. Far too neat." Inspector Merrick's brow furrowed as he examined the scene, not just with the eyes of an investigator, but with the instincts of a man who had seen far too many truths dressed up as lies. "Notice the positioning of the body," he said quietly, signaling to his assistant, Professor Langley. "No signs of distress, no convulsions, no staining around the mouth. The man looks as if he laid down for a nap. It doesn't match the brutality of the other deaths." Langley bent down, inspecting the doctor's features, and looked at the serenity in his face. "Every other victim twisted in their final moments, yet he lies as if cradled by peace. It's as if someone posed him afterward." Merrick nodded grimly, and turned to the confession, lifting it to the candlelight. "The ink tells its own story," he murmured. "It's uneven. Two distinct tones, two different pressures. The early lines flow, but the final paragraph stumbles, either written by someone unfamiliar with the style, or finished by a second hand." He reached for the doctor's medical bag, opening it with deliberate slowness. Inside, a collection of instruments lay in their velvet-lined slots, forceps, scalpels, tongue depressors, but something was missing. "Where is the vial? The specific toxin he claimed to have ingested?" Merrick's eyes narrowed. "It's not here. And more importantly, neither is his black envelope. His key is gone." A heavy silence fell over the room. "Then he didn't write the confession," Langley whispered. "At least not all of it." Merrick turned toward the chamber's heavy oak door. "Observe the lock," he said. "Scratches. Fresh. Someone used a narrow instrument to engage the bolt from outside, after arranging the scene. They wanted us to believe this room was sealed from within." Colonel Redgrave's face darkened with fury. "You're saying the entire scene was staged?" "Meticulously," Merrick replied. "Someone forged the confession, posed the body, locked the room and removed the key, all to halt our investigation, to make us believe the guilty party died with their secret. But they overplayed their hand." Miss Harroway clutched her notebook, eyes wide. "Then who would go this far to divert suspicion?" Merrick didn't answer immediately. He scanned the room slowly, the pieces rearranging in his mind like fragments of a shattered mirror. "Let's count," he said quietly. 4 of us remained after the third murder: Colonel Redgrave, Miss Harroway, myself, and Vincent. The moment his name was spoken, every head turned toward the vacant corner where Vincent, the inspector's soft-spoken deputy, should have been. "He said he had a migraine after dinner," the colonel said, his voice lower now, hesitant. "Said he needed to lie down." "No," Merrick muttered, stepping toward the hallway. "He didn't retreat in pain, he retreated in fear. Or worse, calculation." Suddenly, a sound pierced the tension, a metallic click echoing from the corridor, followed by the subtle creak of a distant floorboard. The temperature in the room seemed to drop, the candlelight quivering with renewed unease. The killer hadn't fled. They were still here, somewhere in the labyrinthine corridors of Ashcroft Hall. The puppet master was still pulling strings. This confession wasn't closure, it was the beginning of their final performance, and the curtain was about to rise. The wind screamed like a soul in torment through the crumbling corridors of Blackthorn Hollow as we sprinted toward Sir Alaric Dorn's chamber, our breath ragged, boots striking the cold stone floor with sharp, echoing thuds. The storm outside raged like a reflection of the chaos unraveling within, and the flickering candlelight in our trembling hands danced violently, casting warped shadows that twisted along the damp, moss-lined walls. When we reached his door, it stood ominously ajar, creaking slightly on its rusted hinges, as though it had been left open in haste, or by force. Inside, the room was shrouded in uneasy stillness, but the signs of a struggle lingered like the last breath of a dying man. The bedclothes were rumpled as though someone had bolted upright from sleep. A crystal brandy glass, half finished, sat beside a scorched piece of parchment, its edges blackened, the ink on its surface warped and unreadable, but unmistakably part of the ancient dossier Eleanor had been translating earlier that night. "He was here recently," muttered Inspector Thorne, crouching beside the still warm fireplace. But something or someone drew him away. In the doorway, Lady Marlowe's silhouette trembled against the light, her voice as thin and strained as the candle's flame. "Then he's not just missing, he's been taken." Her words barely faded when a sudden crash shattered the quiet, a jagged, haunting sound of splintering wood and glass from deep within the manor, followed by a muffled, desperate cry. Without speaking, we surged toward the noise, hearts pounding, the atmosphere around us growing colder with every step. The trail led us through the forgotten wing of the estate, an area long sealed and cloaked in mystery, and finally into the once glorious library, now a battleground of chaos. Shelves had been toppled as if by violent hands, priceless tomes torn and scattered, and a shattered window let in gusts of rain and wind that carried with them the scent of something ancient and decayed. At the center of the room, the grand chandelier swung wildly, as though disturbed by a struggle. Blood, fresh and red, was smeared in streaks across the marble floor, forming a broken trail that led to a hidden doorway newly revealed behind an overturned bookcase. Inspector Thorne's face went pale as he examined the crimson marks. "He didn't go quietly," he said. "They took him, but he fought. He's close, but not safe." We descended into the hidden tunnels beneath Blackthorn Hollow, every step deeper into the earth feeling like a descent into another time, a time buried under layers of guilt, secrets, and betrayal. The stone passages were narrow and suffocating, lit only by the dim glow of our lanterns, and lined with strange forgotten symbols etched into the walls. "5 of the heirs are dead," Thorne said in a low voice. "1 is missing, 2 remain. But why now? Why all of this after centuries?" Eleanor unrolled an ancient scroll she had been studying earlier, a document thought lost in the burning of Ravensthorn Abbey. "Because the story we know is a lie," she whispered. "Isolde Ravensthorn wasn't a traitor, she was a guardian. The others, those noble families, they betrayed her, not the other way around. And now, someone is trying to wipe every trace of her truth from existence." Thorne stopped, turning slowly as realization dawned. "Then the killer isn't hunting heirs out of revenge," he said grimly. "They're hunting to silence the truth, to stop anyone from uncovering what Isolde died protecting." We rounded a final corner and froze. Before us stood a rusted iron gate sealed with strange markings drawn freshly in blood. Beyond it, barely conscious and bound tightly to an ancient altar, was Sir Alaric. His eyes opened slowly, meeting ours with a mixture of relief and warning. But before we could move, a low, bone-chilling whisper echoed through the tunnels. A figure stepped from the shadows, cloaked in white, their face veiled beneath antique lace, their voice soaked in centuries of sorrow and rage. The final blood must be spilled, and the seal restored. For a moment no one breathed. The air itself seemed to tighten. This was no longer a simple murder investigation, it was a ritual centuries in the making, an ancient reckoning brought to life by blood and betrayal. The killer did not seek justice, they sought silence, an end to the last living witnesses who could speak the name Isolde Ravensthorn, not as villain, but as protector. And now, in the forgotten catacombs beneath Blackthorn Hollow, the final chapter was about to be written, not with ink or judgment, but with blood, fire, and the truth long buried in darkness. The vast hall stood cloaked in shadows, and echoes of the storm raging beyond its walls. As Commander Elric Vane slowly rose to his feet, the dim chandeliers casting long fractured lines across his weary figure. His uniform, once crisp and imposing, now bore the grime and torn threads of a night spent chasing horrors born of both history and human cruelty. Though visibly rattled, his spine held firm, his presence undiminished, and when he spoke, it was not with fear or fatigue, but with the cold, commanding resonance of a man who had stared darkness in the eye, and returned with truth clenched in his fist. "Tonight, we have witnessed not merely murder," he declared, his voice piercing the air like a bell tolling for judgment, but the deliberate reenactment of forgotten crimes, stitched together with ritualistic care, draped in the guise of ancestral vengeance. Gasps flickered through the room like candle flames in the wind, as Vane turned his gaze to the 6 portraits newly hung behind the blood-stained lectern, portraits of the victims, each a descendant of those who had once conspired against Lady Aloin Risden. The falsely accused noblewoman burned in 1719 under charges as hollow as the graves they forced upon her name. Each victim was selected, stalked, and executed with symbolism too precise to be coincidence. The poses of their bodies mimicking the testimonies that condemned her, the scenes of their deaths mirroring the false evidence once used to destroy her. He strode beneath the looming portrait of Aloin, her painted eyes burning with a fire that time had failed to dim, and for a moment, it seemed as if she watched not from canvas, but from the very marrow of the stone walls around them. "We were meant to believe these murders were the work of a surviving blood heir," Vane continued. "A ghost returned to correct the sins of old. But the truth is far crueler." Silence fell like a shroud. Dr. Lysandra Crane shifted uncomfortably, her breath fogging her glasses. "Then you're saying it wasn't vengeance?" she asked, her voice small but sharp. "Not in the way we were meant to believe," Vane answered, his tone lowering to a near growl. "The killer is indeed a Risden, a descendant hidden through time, but their purpose was not justice. It was something far more intimate, calculated revenge, disguised in righteousness, born from decades of watching the legacy of their bloodline rot in the hands of those who stole it." Inspector Maddox leaned forward, the firelight reflecting in his eyes. "Who?" Vane inhaled deeply, then began listing the clues. The ancient portrait restored not by chance but with expert care, revealing Elowen cradling a child history had conveniently erased. The confession letter found near Lord Halford's body, forged with cunning, yet betraying subtle tremors in script inconsistent with its supposed author. The hidden corridors used for every murder, knowledge only someone raised within these stone walls could possess. "And then the pendant," Vane said, holding up a small velvet pouch. From it he withdrew 2 halves of a seal, one found clutched in Lady Halford's dead hand, the other retrieved from beneath the floorboards of the servants' quarters. Together, they formed the Risden crest. All eyes turned to Elias Morin, the unassuming chamberlain, who had stood by silently all evening, as though watching a play he had written years ago. "Or should I say, Elias Risden," Vane said quietly, stepping toward him. The old man's eyes narrowed. Gone was the genteel servant. In his place stood a figure brimming with cold fury. "You hid in plain sight," Vane continued. "You grew up within these walls, a ghost among the heirs who never suspected their butler carried the blood of the woman they helped condemn." Morin straightened, the mask finally discarded. "For 50 years I served them," he hissed, his voice rich with venom and pride. "I poured their wine, studied their faces, memorized their histories, all while they dined on what rightfully belonged to me. My grandmother was burned alive, her name disgraced, her child smuggled away like a secret shame. That child was my grandfather. And I am what they feared most, memory made flesh." Maddox stepped forward, tension crackling in the air. "You used this reunion," he said, "to finish the story they started." Morin nodded once. "Every one of them walked into this place, believing they were safe, believing their wealth, their titles, their bloodlines protected them. But history doesn't forget, it waits." His eyes glinted as he added, "And Arlen Halford, poor fool, discovered who I truly was when he unearthed the 7th pendant. That's why he died screaming." Outside, thunder cracked as though the heavens themselves had heard the confession. "This wasn't justice," Vane said at last. "It was obsession, dressed in the robes of legacy." And as the officers moved in, Elias Risden raised his hands, not in fear, but in cold triumph, his shadow stretching long across the stones, where Elowen had once knelt and screamed as they lit the pyre. As the crimson sun crept through the cracked stained glass windows of Ravenshade Manor, A hush fell over the once chaotic hall, where the final pieces of a generations-old puzzle had just clicked into place, and it was Chief Inspector Alaric Rohn, who with slow, deliberate steps, turned to face the stunned gathering. His trench coat still damp from the relentless storm outside. "You all believed the killings began with the arrival of the guests," he said, his voice low, resonant, and measured like a judge passing sentence. "But they began long before any of you stepped through these gates. They began the moment Elias Marrow changed his name." A collective gasp rippled through the room, all eyes snapping toward the seemingly mute archivist, who had stood on the fringes all weekend, his silence mistaken for meekness, his presence dismissed as trivial. Yet it was he who had orchestrated the downfall of an entire bloodline under the guise of fate catching up with forgotten sins. Rohn continued, pacing before the fireplace where embers hissed like coiled serpents. He wasn't just a servant cataloguing the estate's history, he was rewriting it, one corpse at a time. The name Elias Marrow was merely a mask, but his true identity, Elias Calum Dravand, last living heir to the ruined Dravand legacy, destroyed in 1826 when the founders of this estate falsely accused his great-grandmother Honora of witchcraft and treason to seize her land and fortune. The air thickened with dread as Rohn revealed the pattern. The 7 victims had all been direct descendants of those original conspirators, their deaths mimicking scenes from the fabricated trial records Elias had spent decades collecting and manipulating. The locked study, the drowning in the well, the hanging in the belfry, each was an echo of how Honora's supposed crimes were proven by the very ancestors of those who now lay dead. A gloved hand lifted a scorched leather-bound journal from the table, the family crest on its cover now unrecognizable beneath soot. "And here," Rohn said, holding it aloft, "is where Elias detailed every step, each manipulated invitation, every forged letter, even the doctored genealogies that erased his lineage from the estate's legal memory." As the room reeled, the inspector turned to Elias, whose disguise had finally crumbled, revealing not rage or fear, but an eerie calm. "They took everything from me," he said, his voice soft yet unwavering, "and in return, I gave them truth, the kind carved into stone and sealed in blood." Rohn stepped closer. "But justice born of vengeance is never justice, Elias. Your ancestors were wronged, yes, but you became judge, jury, and executioner, playing God in a house built on old lies and newer graves." At that moment, as the constables shackled Elias's hands, a sudden gust of wind flared the dying fire behind him, casting a flicker of light across the long-abandoned portrait of Honora Dravand, her painted eyes now seeming to shimmer with sorrow, rather than fury. "She would not have wanted this," Rohn murmured. "Your pain was real, but this was a requiem sung in the wrong key." As Elias was led out beneath the growing light of dawn, the manor creaked with a sound that was almost like breath, as though the house itself had exhaled after holding its secrets for too long. Later, as I stood beside Rohn watching the fog retreat across the moors, he spoke again, barely above a whisper. "Vengeance always believes it is justice, until it looks in the mirror and finds only the face of another tyrant. The true legacy of Ravenshade was never the gold nor the land, but the lies we tell ourselves to justify the blood we spill." And as the manor shrank behind us, silhouetted against the pale sky, I knew that while the case was closed, the story had merely found its final page, written not in ink, but in sorrow.